everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am Bond, and I am not here with my typical cohort, Nick, Pennsylvania. He is stuck at a pie festival right now. So don't worry about him. He's doing great. But I'm not alone. I'm here with our good friend, Tim Grieve-Carlson. How's it going, Tim?
Brennan, I'm doing great. Very happy to be on another episode.
Yeah, no, I'm really pumped to have you. We've been talking a lot over the last year. It was actually October of last year we had you on for the first time. It seems like it was just yesterday, but it's almost been a year at this point.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. I think it was October 27th, right before Halloween. But we had you on last time, and we talked about Shoemaker, who you were doing, I believe, a course at the time, or a lesson at least, talking about him, and we kind of couldn't resist a chance to talk about Shoemaker, me and Nick. The reason that we even first started talking, me and you, is because I kind of got looped into your book, American Aurora, which is on Johannes Kelpius. And it was one of those things where I first heard, just for clarity for everyone, like the first time I heard Tim speaking was on Strange Familiars, talking with our good friend Tim Renner. And it was like, for someone who listens to dozens of podcasts a week, I feel like it's so rare that I get a few minutes into an author talking and I'm on two sides. One, I'm just like, how in the world have I never heard of this subject before? And two, I'm just like, this guy gets it.
Cool.
I was just so like enamored with like your approach to Johannes Kelpius and just the paranormal in general and folklore. So I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about Johannes Kelpius, who is someone that we've mentioned on this podcast kind of in passing before. And I know we mentioned him on the last episode, just kind of briefly. And there's so much to talk about with Kelpius, as we were kind of just saying.
Sure.
But for those who aren't familiar, can you kind of give us like the elevator, like biography of who Johannes Kelpius was and kind of why he is historically important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you two biographies. I'm going to give you, the first one is kind of the legendary biography of Kelpius, and this is the
Yes.
one that if you Google the name Kelpius today, this is what's going to come up. So Johannes Kelpius was, so first of all, the first place that I read this story, the first time I ever read the name Johannes Kelpius was in the book, the coffee table book, Weird Pennsylvania.
Oh,
If you
okay.
ever had a
Yeah.
chance to look at that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was a kid, and I had a copy of Weird Pennsylvania, and of course it's the series by the Weird New Jersey magazine guys,
Mm-hmm.
and if anyone, I'm sure that everyone who listens to this show is familiar with the book, but it's a big kind of coffee table book that has paranormal stuff, local legends,
Mm-hmm.
oddities, weird history from your state. And in Pennsylvania, there was a spread on Johannes Kelpius, and it described him as the leader of a doomsday cult that
Mm-hmm.
traveled from Germany to Pennsylvania in 1694 because they believed that the world was going to end imminently. And from this enormous tabernacle that they built on the side of a cliff over the Wissahickon River outside of Philadelphia, they looked up in a telescope and waited for signs that the world was going to end. And Kelpius is sort of the leader of America's very first sort of doomsday
Mm-hmm.
cult is the word they always use, but
Right.
he's sort of presented as inaugurating this tradition in American religious history of I use these words sort of facetiously, but freaky cult leaders who
Right. Right.
draw their followers into these weird belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
So and then a
Right.
few other kind of legendary Kelpius things. He was the leader of a secret fraternal group, a secret society, and which has all kinds of interesting machinations throughout American history. Maybe he was one of the Illuminati. Maybe he was a
Right.
Rosicrucian. Maybe he was
Rosicrucians.
some secret other thing. Maybe he actually had a lot to do with what eventually became the founding of the country in Philadelphia, 100
Right.
years or so later. And then the last really, really famous legend about Kelpius is that He was a great astrologer and alchemist and magician, and he was actually so great that he created the fabled Philosopher's Stone, this legendary alchemical substance
Right.
that can turn lead into gold and perfect the souls of human beings along with it. So that's the legendary Kelpius.
Yes, which is
Uh,
very fantastical.
yeah,
Has a lot of elements that, like, if you were making a movie, you'd be like, man, there's a lot to work with here. You
it'd
know,
be
we
too
could.
crazy of a movie.
Right. It would be.
Yeah,
That's no,
yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, it's a really wild story, and you mentioned the weird PA and everything. It's this is another example of how books like that are such like a good, regardless of how accurate they are,
yeah,
they're a great gateway into not only folklore and the paranormal, but just like history in general. So like
definitely.
for as much as we give those things a hard time sometimes, boy do we owe a lot to them. So
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I used to live in New Jersey and I went to college in New Jersey and this is
mhm.
like not pre-internet, but the internet wasn't what it is now. And I remember when a new Weird New Jersey would drop, I would like hoof it to the newsstand to go get it. Like
Right.
it's a great magazine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. And I think that like I mean, what a wild first exposure to Johannes Kelpius. Like you read that and
Yeah.
you're like, this guy checks all the boxes, like Doomsday Cult, Rosicrucians, Philosopher's Stone. It's really paints a very dramatic and romantic picture.
Yeah. And so, I'll introduce the historical biography of Kelpius by saying I'm a I did a PhD dissertation about Kelpius. At first I planned on doing a dissertation project that was about a few more kind of radical religious figures from early
Hmm.
Pennsylvania's history. But as I learned more about Kelpius, and then eventually, when I discovered that this novel, which I'll talk about tonight, titled Wieland, is
Hmm.
mostly about kind of interpreting Kelpius's place in American history.
Right.
Once I realized that one of the first American novels is kind of about Kelpius, I just kind of realized there's much more of a story here and I just need to focus on this.
Right.
And who knows, maybe a book about these other radical religious figures will come in the future. But so.
Hmm.
I grew up in Central PA. I grew up in a city called Lebanon, world baloney capital as far as I'm concerned. And so as I was sort of getting into American religious history, and particularly like radical religious history and esoteric, mystical, supernatural history, things like this.
Hmm.
I started to see, and I've told this story a few times now. I started to see the names of places that I was familiar with, right?
Hmm.
Ephrata,
Right.
Ole in Berks County, places like this, places I kind of knew pretty well
Right.
geographically, but not
Hmm.
historically. And one of the figures who kept coming up was this person, Johannes Kelpius. And all I knew about him was this dim memory of this legend in weird
Hmm.
Pennsylvania. And, and to be honest, I wasn't super interested in figuring out like this doomsday cult. Christian history is full of people who think that the world is going to end imminently.
Right.
And honestly, I think you could make the case that like almost every Christian since Paul has thought that
Hmm.
Christ's return is imminent in
It's,
some
yeah,
way.
right around the
So it's
corner. Right.
yeah, and so it's not a super strange belief for any Christian to have
Hmm.
that the period in history that they're living through is kind of a final or ultimate period in history. So I wasn't super interested in Kelpius until I read a translation of some of his writings, some of
Hmm.
his letters, and they were super interesting. They described things like his life in Pennsylvania, his
Hmm.
sense of the indigenous people there, his sense of Pennsylvania politics. They also described in one letter this strikingly beautiful and fascinating mystical system that he called the threefold wilderness state,
Hmm.
which was his sort of like deep reading of the biblical text and his own sort of understanding of Christian life and practice read through the landscape of Pennsylvania that he was.
Hmm.
The other letter that really stood out to me was a letter he wrote in 1699 where a minister in Rhode Island asked him, "Can you tell me what pietism is?" Kelpius was
Yes.
part of this early
Hmm.
Protestant movement called Pietism, which emphasized this really kind of intense personal, emotional connection with God among Christians,
Mm-hmm.
which at the time was very, very unusual and kind of really radical and got a lot of
Right.
people locked up and some people killed even.
Exactly.
And in this letter, Kelpius describes some of the miracles that he saw as a pietist in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes things like apparitions, people speaking in tongues, people fasting for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, absurd lengths of time. He describes as I said already, kind of visions, all sorts of different manifestations. But one that really stood out to me was he said that people, some of these pietists in their ecstasies could sort of feel the thoughts of people around them. They could know what other people were thinking,
Right.
even people who they had never met before. And this really jumped out at me because, at least in the literature of psychical research, in the history of psychical research, it's pretty well attested that telepathy as a concept, this idea that one
Mm-hmm.
person can read the thoughts of another person, this really only starts ballpark, and we actually have a date for it, 1895. It's
Wow. So
it's
this
not it's not a
really
very old
old
concept,
idea.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and this is sort of, I'm starting to sound like a professor, but we don't have a science of psychology. I mean, William James publishes Principles of Psychology right around this time.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even as like we don't really have much of a theory of mind, right? We
Mm-hmm.
don't really think of our thoughts as thoughts very often. But this was just like a really stunningly early example of a phenomena that would later become like a super well-known fact of psychic
Part of.
research and
Mm-hmm.
paranormal, what we call the paranormal today. So I found this guy thrillingly interesting, and
Mm-hmm.
I also noticed he's not talking about doomsday. He doesn't seem to be part of a mystic fraternity of any kind. He's not
Right.
talking about anything that people say he's talking about. He seems to have a whole other thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I started digging into him, and so at least so far as the historical sources tell us, Johannes Kelpius was he was born in what is now Transylvania in
Mm-hmm.
1667. He was German. He was part of a German ethnic group in Transylvania. His dad was a minister. He was not born into nobility or a wealthy family, but his dad was a country pastor, but he must have been precocious or talented
Mm-hmm.
or something because when he's 18 years old, a few noblemen from a city near the village where he grew up decided to pay for him to go to school in Germany. So
Right.
he must have been kind of special. He must have been kind of talented. He travels from Transylvania to Germany. He the first place he goes to school is the University of Leipzig,
Mm-hmm.
where he enrolls in a program. I'm not certain. I'm looking at a matriculation record from the 17th century, and they're using abbreviations in Latin that I can't be certain of what they mean. But I think he actually enrolls in a program to study law in Leipzig
Right.
at this early date when he's 18 years old. And then something happens, and 6 months later, he's gone. He's left Leipzig. He's gone to another
Right.
university in Tübingen, and he's studying theology. Something has
Mm-hmm.
changed. When Kelpius arrived in Leipzig, this was 1687, he arrived right at the same time that one of the first and most intense sort of study groups of early pietists was taking
Mm-hmm.
place. They called them conventicles, but these were sort of private sessions for Bible study that would become these like really intense exercises and devotion and prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And these were the sort of settings where many of the early pietists say that they saw these miraculous things happen.
And the ecstatic
Um,
visions and
that
yeah,
yeah,
all that. Yeah.
ecstasies, and I want to stress not just like people having visions, but also things like people levitating,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Things like
Yeah.
people who didn't have to eat for a matter of months, right? Things that when Kelpius later described them, he says as a boy, I saw things that I could only compare to the events of Acts of the Apostles.
Right.
these really like intense miracles attributed to the first generation of Christians. So right, the exact month when Kelpius leaves Leipzig is the same month when this particular pietist group in Leipzig disbands.
Hmm.
I can't be certain of this. I think it's pretty likely that Kelpie is somehow linked with this group in Leipzig. When they disband, he's all of a sudden tasted this completely new, strange,
Right.
beautiful form of Christian life,
Hmm.
and he's not going to stick around Leipzig. He wants to follow some of these pietists. He wants to keep doing what he's doing, and so he goes to Tübingen, where there was a lot of early pietist activity. He's in Tübingen for about 2 years, and then basically the King of France just invades
Right.
Western Germany, the Palatinate, this really super fertile region of Germany, where many, I shouldn't say most, but a huge percentage of the people who became the Pennsylvania Germans, the Pennsylvania
Hmm.
Dutch, came from the Palatinate. So it's a area with pretty rich like cultural heritage for people in Pennsylvania. Um, After Louis XIV destroys Tübingen, Kelpius flees to another university, a place called Altdorf, where he finishes his dissertation.
Hmm.
And this is 1689. He finishes his dissertation, and then he publishes a few essays, a few academic essays. He has one long essay on Aristotle, a few other pieces, and he's in really good shape. I mean, he's publishing things with his PhD advisor. He could have easily gone. He's also like absurdly young
Right.
in
Yeah.
early 20s, early
Hmm.
20s. He's a bright guy, a precocious guy. He's writing in German, English, Hebrew, Latin. He definitely could read Greek. He's a brilliant dude. And then all of a sudden, we don't hear anything about Kelpius in any historical record that I know of until the year 1693, when he is making arrangements to flee Europe with a group of some of
Hmm.
the most radical pietists who existed. People who were so radical that if they would have stuck around on the continent, they probably would have been permanently imprisoned or executed.
Hmm. Right.
These were people, one of whom said in print that the Lutheran Church was the Antichrist on earth. That's how sort of kind of like radical and
Right.
individualistic these people were. And so Kelpius makes this enormously consequential decision to leave Germany. He decides that he's going to go to the New World, to America. He actually, in the first line of his little journal that he kept recording the events of his journey, the first sentence is sort of comforted by God, I resolved to go to America.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of this simple statement of determination. They end up stuck in London for 6 months.
Right.
It's really hard to go
Yeah,
from
which sounded
Germany.
sounded rough. Like, yeah, being in
Yeah.
London for those few months, they were basically what surviving on other people's generosity
Yeah,
and
this was one of
everything.
the things that I sort of dug up in the minutes of the London Quaker meeting, but
Hmm.
they did not, people this was another thing that really confirms not only were they not a doomsday cult, but they at no step of the way is it clear that anyone knew what they were doing. They just sort of show up in London with nothing, and there are these like really generous Quakers who
Hmm.
they literally like in the minutes they call them these poor people called pietists, and then they'll sort of note like, okay, like so and so has set aside like 20 pounds
Right.
to keep 40 people alive for a few months. They've sent letters to everyone they know in Germany. They're going to try to figure this out, and it it takes a while. So what I actually think happened probably is I actually think William Penn paid for them to come
Right.
here. At the time, Pennsylvania is a super small colony.
Hmm.
Philadelphia is a very small city. There's like, I think when Kelpius died, someone might need to fact check me on this, but there weren't more than 2,000 people in Philadelphia. Super small city. William Penn really needed to make this colony grow, and he was counting on this huge wave of immigration from Germany in particular.
Hmm.
A pretty comparably speaking, poor country, really populous country, just devastated by wars for decades and
Right.
decades.
Hmm.
And they thought it was going to happen in the 1680s, and it didn't really happen. So there's this mysterious benefactor who just pays for these people to come to
Yeah.
Pennsylvania. I think it was probably William Penn or someone working for William Penn because he really wanted to make sure that Germans who were fleeing some sort of persecution, who were religious minorities or needing to leave the country for whatever
Right.
reason, sort of had Pennsylvania in their heads as an option.
Hmm.
I think that's probably what happened. He makes it to Philadelphia in 1694. He, with a few of his very, I would say, radical religious colleagues, they established this small kind of communal living situation on a cliff over the Wissahickon River. If anyone has ever been to Fairmount Park outside of Philadelphia, that's the place we're talking about. This big, beautiful river cuts through this gorge about 6 miles outside the city. It's a really lovely place to go for a hike next time you're in Philly. And they build a small cottage. Every primary source that describes the place they live describes it as either a cottage or a small house where they all live
Hmm.
together. I don't think their group was ever that big. Honestly, I don't think it ever got over double digits. I think it was a
Right.
really small group of men who tried to model themselves as closely as they could after the earliest Christians. So modeling
Hmm.
themselves after the people that they're reading about in Acts of the Apostles, after some kind of really, trying to practice what they considered to be a form of Christianity that was uncorrupted by orthodoxy, uncorrupted by,
Hmm.
the church that became the Catholic Church, and then eventually even like the Lutheran Protestant Church.
Hmm.
Although Kelpius, I think, probably would have considered himself a Protestant. He really, like, first and foremost would have just called himself a Christian. So in
Right.
some ways, he really preempts this sort of uniquely American form of Christianity, which really tries very hard to like separate itself from
Hmm.
tradition and to sort of say, no, I'm simply a follower of Jesus, and that's my religion, right? This is a pretty new and pretty American style of Christianity, and we can see Kelpius kind of doing it. Kelpius lives on the ridge from 1694 until 1707. He develops this kind of chronic wasting condition of some kind. He
Right.
refers to it in a few different letters. He, he was probably never like super robust or physically strong, and by 1703 in his letters, he's describing being sick a lot of the time, and eventually he does pass away in 1707. In that time, in those short, I guess 13 years that he spent, just about 13 years that he spent on the ridge, he led a pretty amazing and I would say kind of like outgoing and influential life. We know that, for example, he attended festivals and ceremonies held by local Lenape people. He actually tells a
Hmm.
really kind of amazing and sort of funny story about one night when he's at a cantinka, which is a Lenape dance festival. He's there, and another person there is William Penn. And he tells this story in this letter where he says William Penn got up and addressed the whole crowd and started preaching to the Lenape people, basically, and said,
Yeah.
we want to convert you. You should be Christians like us. We want to help you. And then he says, Kelpius says that one of the Lenape people stood up and said, we watch the way you Christians act and we watch what you do. And frankly, we don't think that you Christians live up to the standard that you're preaching. This particular Nape person says specifically, you guys are so anxious about the future and so anxious about who owns what, and you spend so much of your time trying to make sure that this child gets this inheritance, this person gets this thing, this little bit of money goes to this person, this little bit of money goes to that person. And then this person says, and we just trust God to take care of us and to take care of our children in perpetuity. We don't see why we should become like you. And Kelpius, in the letter, sort of says at this moment, kind of, he describes William Penn as abashed in this moment, like
Hmm.
humiliated, kind of.
Hmm.
And in the letter, it's really interesting. Kelpius, he doesn't come out and say as much, but the implication in the letter is that the Lenape are just right. You know,
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, hard
that's
to
like
argue with that.
a fair critique. Yeah.
Yeah.
He also he writes a lot of poems. He writes a lot of
Hmm.
songs that are meant to be sung in multiple voices,
Right.
and he writes a lot of the letters that I described earlier, where he describes some of the things that he witnessed that eventually kind of became part of what we would call the paranormal today, and
Hmm.
also develops this really kind of beautiful and interesting mystical system. As I said, he dies in 1707, but he remains really influential. And I'll limit it to like two or three little points. If anyone has heard of the Ephrata community, the Ephrata
Hmm.
Cloisters out there in eastern Pennsylvania, the founder of the Ephrata community, Conrad Beissel, traveled from Germany to Pennsylvania in the early 18th century because he wanted to apprentice himself to Kelpius. And by the time
Yeah.
he made it to Pennsylvania, Kelpius had passed away. But
Hmm.
the community that Beissel founded, Ephrata, of course, becomes this enormous and super influential early American religious community. In the 18th century, they their printing press is only competing with Benjamin Franklin in terms of like output of literature that they're
Right.
generating. So super influential early American cultural institution at Ephrata. As I also said, Kelpius becomes, I think, kind of one of the main sort of figures that one of the first American novels is trying to understand. This
Wayland.
is a novel by Charles Brockden Brown, yeah, called Wieland,
Hmm.
in which tells the story of this radical pietist from Germany who travels to America, who settles on a cliff over the Wissahickon outside of Philadelphia, and who builds this tabernacle on the cliff, and has these sort of nightly kind of private religious devotions. And just to summarize some points of the novel really quickly, this figure is actually killed by a mysterious column of light that comes out of the
Yeah.
sky. And the rest of the novel is about his children trying to understand paranormal phenomena in early America. It's a really crazy, beautiful novel. And as I said, it really is, I think, at the very opening of kind of American literature, trying to understand the memory of Johannes Kelpius. So
Well,
go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say, and that book was really popular at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's hard
I guess
to know
quantify that
exactly.
maybe, but
Certainly it was. I mean, Charles Brockden Brown was a widely read early American author. He published a lot, not only novels, but magazines and almanacs and other kinds of
hmm.
publications. Certainly, as far, it's hard to say how popular it was just because kind of then as now, how many Americans actually picked up and read intellectual novels, right? So
Right,
it's hard to say for
right.
sure, but nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it was not it's not a minor novel.
Hmm.
It's not marginal. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost like because that was again such a short period of time after Kelpius's death. That's almost like the first. It's again, it's not a historical record, but that's like the first big introduction of him into the cultural zeitgeist
Mhm.
outside of his own work. Because, like you said, he did write these letters and everything. We don't have we don't have like him listing here's everything that I believe or a journal or anything. We have these letters and we have and there was wasn't there a pamphlet of hymns as well?
Yeah, he wrote a book of hymns, yeah, called
Yeah.
The Lamenting Voice of the Hidden Love. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
which sounds wild to begin with.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I think that like he's someone who was very important in a small in like for only being here, like you said, for like 13 years on the ridge. You can see how someone looking back only, 50, 100 years after this could conflate the stories in Wayland with the historical facts about him and the lack of like firsthand writings.
Yeah.
You can almost like see where that kind of stokes the flames of speculation about him.
Yeah, and that's really what I found. So as I said, there's this legendary Kelpius, right?
Hmm.
Who kind of doesn't have a whole lot to do with the historical figure.
Right.
And the main thing that I've picked up sort of slowly in doing research about this guy and writing about this guy is that every kind of generation looks towards the past, whatever it may be,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of sees the thing that they're primed to see in it, right?
Right.
And of course not all the time, and I'm sure that I'm doing this to some extent with
Oh,
Kelpius too,
yeah.
right? But I mentioned the legend that Kelpius is the lead part of, or maybe a leader of a secret society of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
This really only, the first time anyone talks about this is in the late 19th century when all of a sudden people in Europe and the United States are really anxious about Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is really
Yeah.
taking off, and people are and in part this is also sort of wrapped up in like anti-Catholicism
Mm-hmm.
and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of anti-Semitism stuff, and there's just a whole lot of anxiety over, well, what are these different groups of people doing?
Right.
What are the Masons talking about in these private meetings? And I'm being, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but there was
Right. Right.
real anxiety over and interest in secret societies and fraternal organizations. And when those people look back at this weird little group of men on the ridge, they're like, those guys were Illuminati. Those guys
Those guys
were,
were up to something. They got to be
yeah,
up
they
to
were clear.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when we get to the early 20th century, we have sort of like early 20th century, late 19th century occultists and esoteric figures.
Mm-hmm.
People like A.E. Waite
Mm-hmm.
look with new eyes towards Kelpius, not as a pietist or a member of a secret society, but they're looking at him as an occultist of some kind, an early example of sort of like a
Mm-hmm.
practitioner of the esoteric arts, right?
Right. It's almost like it seems like it's almost like people look, and again, this isn't unique to this situation. People look back for validation in
Yeah,
something to say like, hey, here's where our lineage of this way of thinking, or um, it's almost to add provenance. It's like, oh,
totally.
see, they were already doing this, so we're established. This isn't just something I made up last Tuesday, you know?
One thing that we sort of see in the study of almost any kind of like religious, but particularly like esoteric
Mm-hmm.
tradition is people love to feel like they're connected to some kind of ancient wisdom.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And this is like so common that it almost sounds silly to just say it plainly, but people really want to know to believe that the tradition that they're participating in or being
Oh,
becoming connected with has
yeah.
these deep ancient roots.
Mm-hmm.
This is wisdom from, the classic example is Hermes Trismegistus was a philosopher from the time way before Moses, even, right?
Right.
This is a story
Yeah.
that,
Mm-hmm.
ancient Greeks and then people in the Renaissance would tell all the time that before Moses, there was this other guy, Hermes,
Right.
right?
Right.
And people really like that. The other thing, and this is even more mundane, is people love hermits. we don't really
That is
have
true.
we
Yep.
don't really have hermits anymore, and it's kind of awful. We have like it would actually be illegal to be a hermit in the United States
Mm-hmm.
today. We just rounded up all the homeless people in Pittsburgh.
Right.
But
Ugh.
people used to love hermits and used to
Mm-hmm.
hermits used to be a really vibrant part of not only American society, but like kind of like almost
Mm-hmm.
global
Right.
society. And
Right.
the origins of Christian monasticism are in the people that today we call the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and these were
Mm-hmm.
Christians in what is now Egypt and the Middle East and other parts of North Africa, and basically the fourth and fifth centuries, who kind of like Kelpius in some ways, were just trying to practice this really austere, simple form of Christianity as they understood it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where we get, Christian orders of monks and nuns.
Right.
And much closer to home, I know you guys had Tim Renner on a couple
Right.
months ago talking
Mm-hmm.
about his new hermit book.
Mm-hmm.
Hermits are just fascinating figures. They're great things to talk about. And I think that's another sort of engine of what has made people interested in Kelpius.
Yes.
For the people of Philadelphia, there's this story about this strange man up on the ridge.
Mm-hmm.
and who knows what he was getting up to. Right? And I make this point in the book too, and feel free to cut me off. I could go on and
No, you're all
on.
good. You're good.
Philadelphia is a city that, if you've ever spent time there, it's a city that is like relentlessly commemorative and
Oh, for
relentlessly
sure.
like monumentalizing all of its history. There's many, many statues, many, many monuments, many museums, right? This is, this is kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
for American national origins, this is our legendary city,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a city where the past is just on permanent display all the time. Every little
Mm-hmm.
inch of the past is on display in Philadelphia. The legend of Kelpius is totally hidden. You really need to know someone who can show you how to get there. You
Right.
need to know someone who can kind of tell you, oh, he had the Philosopher's Stone. He was the leader of a doomsday cult. It's kind of, not that there's a secret password, but it's like insider knowledge, right?
Right.
And so I think in Philadelphia, in a city like Philadelphia, that kind of like insider knowledge, legendary quality is pretty potent and pretty intriguing to a lot of people.
Well, right. And that kind of adds a in-group element to it where it's like, I feel like there's certain things that people, when they're getting into history of a certain place, you come across something and you go, oh, this is a marker of how deep you're getting into things.
Hmm.
And whether, I mean, like I said, you can get there from looking at a weird Pennsylvania book, or you can, I'm sure there is a little marker on Google Maps for the Kelpius grave
Oh yeah.
location and everything, where you're just like, what the heck is this? And then you start
Hmm.
looking into it, and like we say all the time, like you start digging, and it's like things just get weirder and weirder a lot of times.
Hmm.
Um, like I remember the first time we started looking at the portals in Joe Magarac in Pittsburgh. That was one of those things. I remember when we were younger, first time starting to look at that, it was just like, what in the heck is all of this? And then
Yeah.
before you know it, you're looking at, like, labor history disputes. It's just
Totally.
so,
Totally.
which is like fun, which is like really fun, and it's good for people, I think. Um, but I think you're right. There is this, like, it's funny how certain things that are kind of out in the open are also kind of hidden, and that's where some of the occult speculation kind of comes in, and that's where the people start milling over things, and that's when the legendary Kelpius starts dovetailing from the historical Kelpius. And you want people to, in theory, always look at the historical record and really get into it, because again, I think in a lot of ways you could say that the historical Kelpius is, maybe not as fantastical, but endlessly interesting. It's not
Totally.
it's not it's not like you're going to be disappointed by the reality of it. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's how it normally goes. So, like you mentioned, with people in the city of Philadelphia, how is, amongst those people who are in the know, how do people kind of speak about Kelpius now? Is it people a lot of times referring to the historical record, or is it people kind of proliferating what we've been calling the legendary Kelpius?
That's a good question. I mean, I hear all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
different things, and I would say, I guess I would say most of what I've heard from people in Philly is legendary stuff, and in some ways, it's kind of fun to watch. The legend is still like growing, right?
Right.
So. And for a lot of people, the place where Kelpius lived, the ridge of the Wissahickon, is haunted by the ghosts of these
Right.
hermits, and
Yeah.
it's actually like you can go and sort of like legend trip to that area as like a
Mm-hmm.
haunted location, right? Um, I've heard all kinds of things. We don't actually know where Kelpius is buried.
Right.
But someone asked me this at a talk I gave in Philadelphia about a year ago. And I gave this long answer. I said, there's this legend he's supposed to be buried under the altar of this one church in Germantown. We don't
Mm-hmm.
really know. I think he was probably buried in this person's backyard, a friend of his who would have taken care of him as he really got sick. And
Mm-hmm.
then this person said, well, I actually know where he's buried. And I said, "Oh, whoa."
Yeah,
And
that perks you up. Yeah.
they were like, "Yeah, I mean, I like it came to me in a dream, and I know like exactly where he's buried." And I was like, "That's
Man.
awesome." Yeah.
Yeah, like that's
Like,
okay, man. Like
cool. Um,
hook, line, and sinker. Let's go.
Totally. And so you know, one thing that people show me all the time, there's a pretty popular Philadelphia tarot deck, and of
Hmm.
course the Hermit is Kelpius,
Right.
and so you know, the legend is still growing. I do think as I'm more and more in touch with people who have read the book, there's
Hmm.
a little bit more familiarity with the historical Kelpius. But you know, in some ways, he's the historical Kelpius isn't not strange, right? He's still
For
this,
sure.
yeah, this
Yeah.
pretty like fascinating, mystifying, and in some ways, I feel like if you read the book, I've, you know, I've told a story that I think, at least insofar as historical records can show us, is true, and that means it's
Hmm.
actually more complicated and mysterious and kind of weird than the legend, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that like two of the things that like I took away just as being really, really interesting about the book that I felt like I could just even before we get into like the folkloric stuff, just like personally almost,
Hmm.
the idea that these pietists were like encountering ecstatic visions and these miracles on like a I don't say daily, but on a regular basis, it seemed like it was relatively normalized. Um, they come to a place that is, quote unquote wilderness, on the edge of the city and everything. And they have this really, I don't know, I guess like formative relationship with nature and how they see the world. And I
Hmm.
think one of the things that like I learned from the book and studying Kelpius was just how differently these people looked at the interaction between themselves, God, and like the natural world around them.
Hmm.
Um, that for me was honestly for over 300 years old was actually very refreshing
Hmm.
to hear. It's funny whenever I was because you mentioned Hermes earlier. Uh, you, Prior to reading your book, every time I ran into people talking about Hermetic, and anytime they say Hermetic something, just me speaking personally, that stuff usually never rang true with me because it seemed like it was always associated with stuff that just like I didn't jive with. It just didn't just
Hmm.
did it just didn't whatever wavelength, whatever, it never clicked for me. But there were so many times where I would read in this book stuff that either Kelpius wrote or things that other pious were saying, and you were mentioning how this was kind of hermetic in origin.
Right.
Um, I would read these quotes and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that checks out. And then I'm like, wait, am
Yeah.
I like is like am I actually much more hermetic in philosophy than what I initially thought, maybe? And but like I say all that to say that like when you look at these historic figures that are incredibly interesting and it is kind of weirder than what you expect. I think the context of how they were living is so important. Like you mentioned that they were living this very like ascetic, simple life and how that must have affected how they viewed the world around them and everything. So it's hard for us to kind of get in the mindset of, well, how did people view Kelpius from a contemporary standpoint versus how we're looking at him now? Like, is it even possible for us to get a good idea of what that was actually like? Is there a way for us to get to the real Kelpius and get away from the legendary Kelpius entirely? Like,
Yeah.
does time allow us for that? It's I don't know if there's an answer, but
No, well,
that's
it's a good question. I mean, the answer is probably not, right?
mhm.
At least until we develop a way to become, you know, a time-faring historian.
Eventually
Um,
we will get
yeah.
there.
And just like a few things what you're saying, you know, just off the top of my head, I mean, just the questions of the day in Kelpius's time were just different. So like
Right.
the
That's a big
main
part
the
of it.
yeah, the
Yeah.
main thing that Kelpius is sort of like, you know, the main thing, but the context that we have to understand a guy like Kelpius in is like the Reformation, right?
Right.
So there's this total consensus in the Western world about religion, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
there's a total consensus about the nature of truth, political
Mm-hmm.
authority, right? How we should live as individuals and communally. And then after the Reformation, and it was a long time coming, and of course I certainly don't think the Reformation was like a bad thing. It paved the way for a lot of the stuff we enjoy today. But that
Mm-hmm.
that consensus breaks down, and Europe basically goes to war for like a century.
Right. Hundred
After
Years'
after
War.
that
Yeah, which
after
was
the
really bad.
coherence,
Like it was
yeah,
like,
after
yeah,
that coherence between religious
mm-hmm.
and political authority breaks down, things do get really ugly. And like the urgent intellectual question of Kelpius's day was like, what is like the correct form of Christianity? And it goes without
Right.
saying that there is a correct form, and that means that everyone else is doing it wrong.
Right.
And so like a few things that we like take for granted today, for example, you know, freedom of religion, really just
Mm-hmm.
like individuality, right? Like
Right.
sometimes I'll tell my students and they kind of don't believe me, but the notion of like human rights or
Mm-hmm.
like individual rights, this is like an utterly modern way of
Right.
thinking,
It's not
right?
as, yeah.
That you're an
Mm-hmm.
autonomous individual and you can expect certain things as a result of this, like comparatively speaking, this is kind of a new way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Other things about Kelpius that are really like in his time, like I said, Kelpius dies in 1707.
Mm-hmm.
Right up until and we can date this like very surprisingly precisely. Things like alchemy and astrology in particular
Right.
are really
Right.
philosophically and scientifically not necessarily in vogue, but they're certainly in play, right?
Right.
Sir Isaac Newton is interested in astrology, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's interested in alchemy. His science and his mathematics and his own understanding are in some ways like a religious and theological exercise, right? For Isaac Newton, understanding
Mm-hmm.
how the earth goes around the sun, this is like just a window into God's mind.
Right.
By the time we get to around 1720, uh, early part of the middle of the 18th century, this this starts to really separate, and we get clear
Mm-hmm.
separations between theology and what becomes the sciences. And then the sciences start to really push out a lot of the religious stuff. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
astronomy starts to really firmly push away astrology. Chemistry starts to really firmly start to push away alchemy. And we sort of end up where we are. But one of the results of that is for people reading Kelpius's writings, even just a few decades after he died,
Mm-hmm.
he really seemed kind of freakish, right?
Right.
Talking about
Right.
sort of like the gold under the earth, how like intense pressure, refines it.
Right.
This is how he
Yeah.
wants to be refined.
Mm-hmm.
And in one letter, one of my favorite sentences in his whole all of his letters are, he's writing to someone and he says, if you ever want to like just look God directly in the face, and I'm paraphrasing something extensively, but if you ever want like a real clear,
Mm-hmm.
close, intense vision of God, take a look at what's going on in the sky. And he
Mm-hmm.
says, meteors, comets, anything strange going on in the sky, that is how God communicates with us. So keep your eye on the sky. And of course,
Right.
some of the legends around Kelpius, after he dies, are of sort of weird aerial phenomena that he
Right.
was interested in, and things that I think today we would sort of consider UFOs, basically. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 You do mention a few of those in the book. That whenever they just whenever again, because a lot of times there's multiple people describing these things. It's not like it's just like, oh, one person saw a weird light in the sky. It's like these
yeah,
were witnessed by lots of people. You hear them describe it, and you're like, what? how is that not a UFO?
Yeah.
Like again, not saying it was aliens, not saying it was, a physical craft, or not saying any of that stuff, but just weird things were happening back then too. Um,
Oh
and
yeah.
and you can understand how someone just like today would use the lens of what they have to interpret it. Um, and you can understand how someone like Kelpius, who was, looking up all the time, and
Right.
sees God in the natural world, and there's the world around you is the gospel. Because I think nowadays we would say, oh, they're divining God's intention, or they're trying to. It's almost it's analogous with reading tea leaves.
Hmm.
And it seems like, from what I remember from the book, they didn't look at those things as like it's not like it was fortune telling.
Yeah.
It really seemed like it was more like, we might not know what God is saying, or we might not know what this means, but it is a communication of some sort that shows us a deeper truth about the
Right.
world around us. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, one example I can give that any most people will probably be familiar with, the rainbow, right?
yes.
And the Christian imagination is just it's a miracle, and it's like
Hmm.
utterly kind of like wondrous, and it's just a clear statement from God for human beings
Right.
about a specific thing, right?
Right.
And this is the sort of like interpretive lens through which Kelpius is interpreting all kinds of strange aerial phenomena.
Right. And this kind of leads into that threefold wilderness state that you had kind of mentioned earlier, um,
Right.
which again, I think, was a very it's almost like you hear some of these things sometimes and you're like, how can people like disagree with this? It's like, yeah, like it's very, it makes it sound very nice. So can you kind of give just like a brief, because I know you could probably do a whole paper on just threefold wilderness state, but can you
Yeah.
kind of give everyone just like a brief um overview of like what that was for Kelpius?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we find it in this letter, this like 8 or 9 page letter that
Mm-hmm.
Kelpius wrote, and he wrote it to a friend, a woman, a Quaker missionary named Esther Palmer, and he opens the letter by saying, "Hey, we got cut off the last time we were talking. I was explaining this, and just so I didn't make myself misunderstood,
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of write this down so it got across." And so we immediately get the sense that the only reason Kelpius is giving us like his sort of final theological statement is because he wants to make sure that
She
his
gets
friend,
it.
yeah, she gets it.
Which
So
is such a, sorry to interrupt you, but that is such like a
yeah.
human moment for Kelpius.
Oh,
Like
totally.
like when you think of like, like we're talking about him in a lot of very like heady language and everything. And I love the fact that this letter was just because he got like, someone had to leave, and afterwards he's like, you know what? I want to make sure she gets what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like, how many of us have I had to like call our friend the day later and be like, hey, just to clarify,
Yeah. Just to clarify.
like
Yeah.
I just thought that was a very like the serendipity and the humanity around that. I just think is beautiful. So,
Right.
sorry,
Yeah,
please continue.
totally. Yeah. So um, he he starts to describe. So Kelpius is a theologian. He's
Hmm.
trained in the biblical text. He knows it inside and out. And he in this letter he starts describing what he sees as sort of like a common pattern from some of the major figures in the Bible. Moses, Elijah, in the Hebrew Bible, Christians call the Old Testament, and then
Hmm.
in the New Testament, John the Baptist and Jesus. And he says, if you look at all of these four figures, these real like kind of, the cream of the crop, basically,
Right.
in the biblical text, their biographies have certain things in common. When they start out, they're kind of not ready for what they're doing, right? They
Hmm.
start out, when we first meet Moses, um, he's really overzealous. He doesn't know what he's doing. He freaks out. He kills this Egyptian, and he's just like not ready for prime time. Same thing with Elijah,
Yeah.
and both of them. spend a period after this overzealous introduction in this prolonged kind of wilderness sojourn, this wilderness retreat.
Mm-hmm.
When we meet John the Baptist, he's in this wilderness setting. Jesus, no less than Jesus, also has this,
Mm-hmm.
spends this prolonged period of time in the wilderness. And then after they spend this time in the wilderness, they emerge kind of fully put together. Kelpius elaborates this kind of mystical system, basically, and it is a system.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually kind of complicated, of sort of human spiritual development, Christian spiritual development, that he calls the threefold wilderness state. The first state he calls the barren wilderness, and this is the state that
Yes.
most ordinary people are in which nothing they really try to accomplish can come to any great result. They're often just kind of thwarted spiritually. They're unfulfilled. They are, in Kelpius's words, they're always sort of reaching out towards Israel, but never really kind of
Mm-hmm.
entering the promised land. Following that first state, there's a second state that Kelpius calls the fruitful wilderness. And for most human beings, for most Christians, this is kind of like the height of spiritual life, right? When someone has undergone this long
Right.
dark night of the soul, undergone this really intense sort of spiritual purification, and has emerged on the other side. And Kelpius says of those figures in the Bible, the figures who are the most sort of accomplished and important and special, what they have in common is this prolonged period in a wilderness setting. Kelpius says
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing in this during this time is never really made clear. We have to sort of infer it. But he kind of concludes they're undergoing this process of sort of meditation, prayer,
Mm-hmm.
contemplation, and really deliberate spiritual development. As you said a moment ago, Brendan, sort of Kelpius's basic philosophical perspective was that creation, the waking world, the cosmos, was a source of knowledge right alongside the
Mm-hmm.
scriptures, right? That people
Mm-hmm.
could sort of interpret and learn from and exist within and gain in wisdom and insight and knowledge from just as they would from the scriptures. Um, and this is exactly what must have happened in the lives of people like Moses, Elijah, John, and Jesus, that
Right.
sort of deliberate reading and understanding of what he would call God's second book, the book of creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, was the source of this new knowledge they came to. And then it's a threefold wilderness state because there's a third and final sort of
Mm-hmm.
status that one can reach, the wilderness of the elect of God, which Kelpius says, I think that probably only five or six people in human history have ever gotten here. And these are human beings who are so sort of completely in tune with God that they're kind of God's living instruments on earth. So people like Moses, Elijah, John, Paul, people like this.
Yeah. No, which
So,
I
yeah, that's it.
yeah, I really liked how whenever he gets to that third thing, it's because it was funny because when I was reading it, I was like having flashbacks to reading Nietzsche and stuff with like the
Mm,
Übermensch and everything,
hmm.
and also thinking about like the release from Samsara and everything, and some of the
Totally.
um, and I almost kind of like how whenever Copius gets to that third state, he's kind of like, yes, this is what we're shooting for, but
Yeah.
but uh, but if you don't get there, there's only a few people that have actually gotten there. So it's
He's like,
like,
we don't really got to worry about this.
yeah, it's like don't make that be the bar, which was
Yeah.
like again kind of like this like very real moment where it's like you can separate like what is actually attainable from like the from just from it still being the right path though.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting how from like a philosophical standpoint, I guess I should ask, how like radical was that from like what the other pietists thought, let alone what the Lutherans thought about like being able to like know God or know knowledge or whatever you want to kind of however you want to frame that.
Yeah, it was actually super radical. So, one of the, kind of like a really important part of Protestant and Orthodox Lutheran teaching is, in Latin we call it sola scriptura, that the
Hmm.
only source of religious knowledge is in the scripture, period.
Hmm.
And in the Protestant context, this means you and I don't have to listen to priests. We don't
Right.
have to listen
Right.
to the Catholic hierarchy, and tradition can never tell us how to interpret scripture. It's right there plainly on the page.
Hmm.
Another sort of big sort of thing that Protestants sort of evacuate from the Christian tradition is kind of the sacraments and the role of
Hmm.
the sacred in sort of everyday
Right.
life, right? So
Hmm.
not only can a priest not tell me what to do, he also can't forgive my sins, and he can't say a prayer to heal me. He can't
Hmm.
do any of these other things
Right.
that many people have sort of been relying on. But another kind of really important thing for Protestants is that, all Christians consider the material world to be fallen in some way, right? It
Right.
used to be
Right.
perfect, now it's not. But for Protestants, the fallenness is really kind of dialed up to 11, right?
Hmm.
And it's not only the world used to be perfect and now it's not,
Hmm.
but it's actually the age of miracles has ended, and God is no longer really like actively participating
Hmm.
in creation in any way,
Right.
right? And by the time we get to Calvinism, by the time we get to certain forms of Calvinism, things are so kind of already set in motion that
Right.
like it,
That
it
very
kind of doesn't
deist
matter.
idea of the
Yeah,
whole the clockmaker. Yeah.
sure.
And
Yeah. And so for, hugely consequential theological moment for what eventually for the supernatural and what eventually becomes
hmm.
the paranormal, because any claim of any sort of miraculous event in the world
Hmm.
um, can no longer be attributable to God, and that means it has to be attributed to the other guy, right? And this
Right.
is the
Yeah.
source of that like really intense like proliferation of
Hmm.
like diabolism and interest in
Hmm.
like witchcraft and witch hunts and devil worship in many places in Europe in the 17th century, because every supernatural manifestation of any kind can only have one source or one
One
cause.
source.
Yeah. And so yeah, super consequential, but the real, and the pietists are completely the opposite in almost every way.
Hmm.
Kelpius just does sort of an interesting fact about Kelpius. The devil, Satan, hell doesn't appear anywhere in his writings. That's pretty weird for a 17th century Christian. He's just like
Yeah.
not interested in that thing. And the same is pretty true for lots of pietists. And the reason for that was um, or the reason for that in terms of their understanding of sort of miracles and the supernatural and the role that God has on earth is
Hmm.
because, like I said, they want to imitate the earliest Christians, and so they read Acts of the Apostles, and in Acts of the Apostles and in the letters of Paul, et cetera, things like miracles, things
Hmm.
like miraculous fastings, levitation, speaking in tongues, et cetera. These are unambiguously signs of God's attention, goodwill.
Hmm.
Paul even calls them gifts. He calls them
Right.
charisms, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Paul
Yes.
says when something like this happens, that is God saying, "Hell yeah, dude, rock and
Hmm.
roll, go for it,"
Right.
And so the pietists just kind of take that and run with it, and they sort
Hmm.
of they don't really. And so, I'm talking about a huge historical movement in really
Right.
general terms.
Right. Right.
Most pietists would have also considered themselves Lutherans to some
At the
extent in
same
some
time.
way.
Yeah.
And in the same way that like most religious people of any denomination
Hmm.
aren't super
Hmm.
interested in like the philosophical intricacies of their tradition, right? Um, they're just doing it because it works for them, and they're
Right.
not, yeah, worried about these details that people like Luther and Calvin are very, very worried about. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because like again, we're if we're trying to put ourselves in the mindset of trying to understand the difference between the historical Kelpius and the legendary Kelpius. Like again, I kind of started this conversation being like, ah, like, the people who are proliferating the legendary version like need to like check themselves.
Mhm.
But like the more like the more we talk about it and the more I read about them and everything, it's like, man, like it's hard not to look at someone who believed that everything around them was like basically early paranormal things, like people levitating
Mhm.
and signs, UFO UAPs slash signs from God in the sky.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
it's very easy to take the things that we see nowadays around us in the language of the paranormal and the kind of like what we'll call like the fun side of history that gets people in the door. You almost can't blame people for using Kelpius as a vehicle for these kinds of conversations,
Certainly.
which
Yeah.
because again, you kind of start with like, oh, who is this weird guy that used to live on the ridge out there? And then before you know it, you're talking about, how one knows God.
Yeah.
It's just like you're like, man, that got out of hand quickly,
It's
in
true.
like
And I
in the
mean, it's
best
funny. I've
way,
heard
in the
people
best
say the
way.
same thing about getting into UFOs too. You start
Oh my
out
God.
saying like, man, I think like they really have some bodies in at Wright-Patterson. And then like 6 months later, you're like meditating, trying to like
Oh
enact the
my God,
contact protocols.
you're doing C5 or whatever, CE5
Yeah.
or whatever. Yeah, it I mean, which is really it's like anything. I mean it's just, anytime you dive into stuff, this is kind of what happens. So it's like it's never surprising. Um, I bet people who get real into trains are like, but when it comes to the paranormal and people like Kelpius, we see them being used a lot of times for again, to get people through the door in one way or another. It's
Mhm.
kind of, and I guess I'm someone who always sees that and goes like, oh, we need to tell the real story, kind of thing. We need to, get to the heart of it because like I think that's how you kind of honor that person and everything, and that's how you keep them alive in some way, and that's where you find the really quote unquote really good stuff. But I think part of it is that's me trying to put my perspective still onto Kelpius, that is still something that I kind of need to check, I guess. Again, I think my intentions are good for wanting to get to the real versus the legendary, but I think the legendary still has a lot of value and a lot to offer. Um,
Definitely.
and I think that probably goes for other people and throughout history, kind of like we said earlier. So we could talk all night about Kelpius. Uh, but for those of you who we haven't yet convinced to read this book, I'm going to say it again: read the book. I've sent it to half a dozen friends over the last year,
Oh,
um,
nice.
and because I'm just like, because just every time it comes up in conversation with people, I'm like, you need to get through this, and everyone who I've sent it to has enjoyed it. So,
Oh, awesome.
for how much we talked about from his origins to the pious beliefs to the threefold wilderness path to the Wayland novel, like really, we just kind of scratched the surface tonight. There's there's so much there, I think. But I want to thank you for talking with us tonight. Again, I'm bummed that Nick wasn't able to be here. I know he would have wanted to get into the etymology of the word wilderness and how it was used back then from a biblical
Oh, cool.
context versus versus how we use it now. But we'll save that for our next conversation. Um,
Yeah, that'd be
so,
great.
well, again, so not the last time we're going to have you on, Tim. But for those of you who do want to reach out to you and everything, uh, again, the book is called American Aurora. The full title is American Aurora: Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius, and that just came out last year. I feel like it's crazy that it's only been out for a little over a year, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, it
Uh,
feels a little while.
yeah, but I mean, in the best way. But yeah, so go check the book out. Do you have any other kind of projects you're working on right now, or any other books that are like? I know that's always like a loaded question, but anything
No,
in
I
the
do. Yeah.
pipeline?
So, well, okay, a couple things. So, I'm finishing a book about a place in East Texas called the Big Thicket. It's a book about sort of the paranormal and environmental
Mm-hmm.
history in this really sort of special biodiverse region of East Texas.
Oof.
Um, I'm also I'm in the pretty early stages of working on a book about cryptozoology, and in
Oh.
particular how what we call cryptozoology today kind of emerged from the history of sort of like colonialism
Mm-hmm.
and anthropology, basically,
Right.
as Western people and scientists and colonial administrators tried to understand basically like non-Western ways of understanding the natural world, and they
Mm-hmm.
often misinterpreted spiritual beings as undiscovered animals that they could discover and make a name for themselves. But the kicker is
Right.
people really do seem to see cryptids. So what does that mean?
What
So
does that
that's
mean?
yeah, so that's the book I'm working on right now. And if
Oh,
anybody is sort of local to the Eastern PA area, I'm giving talks in September. I'm giving a talk about this book for the Friends of the Wissahickon Association in, ooh, you're gonna have to Google it. I think it's the 18th. I think it's September the 18th. Please
okay.
Google it. I
Yeah.
should know this off the top of my head. And the day after that, maybe it's the 19th, close to that. I'm giving a talk at the Ephrata Cloister Museum in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, about this 18th century poltergeist case from Ephrata, which I've been really diving deep into the last few months, and it's super interesting. This really fascinating, well-attested, crazy ghost story from early America
Wow.
that I'm going to be talking about. So if anyone is local, please, Google those events, figure out the actual date, which I should know, but I don't.
Yeah.
And if anyone has any issue, figuring that out, please feel free to shoot me an email. If you Google my name, I'm easy to find. So yeah.
No, no, that's all sounds endlessly fascinating. I'm very excited about the cryptozoology one. I'm very excited about the big thicket one. I've been wanting to talk to someone about the intersection between cryptozoology and like the anti-environmentalism movement.
Oh, yeah.
So like we're gonna have to chat about that. So,
Yeah, that sounds cool.
um, fantastic. Okay. Well, yeah, and everything that you did just mention that we can, I'll put in the show notes. So those
Awesome.
those
I appreciate it.
those will be in there and everything for everyone. Because I know we do have quite a few listeners in on the eastern side of the state, and we have a few listeners that are right in the Wissahickon Valley, basically.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Shout out to those folks. You know who you are. Um, but again, yeah. So thank you so much, Tim. Again, not the last time you're going to be on here, obviously, but really. Like I can't sell this book enough, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. I appreciate your time, your thoughts, your friendship, and I hope everyone out there has a fantastic evening. So take care, everyone.